So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for waiting. It has already passed the scheduled time to start the last session of the day. How should the democracies around the world work together within the tenets of democracy, peace, and the liberal order? We would like to start the session every year for this conference. There are like-minded countries, 10 of them. There are think tanks from these 10 countries participating in these conferences every year. So we are 10 speakers all together in this session. I'd like to introduce the speakers. First, from the United States, Senior Vice President, Council of Foreign Relations of the United States, Dr. James Lindsay. And from France, Director, French Institute of International Relations, Mr. Thomas Gomart. And from UK, Senior Fellow of the Chatham House, John Nelson Wright. And from Italy, Ettore Greco, Executive Vice President, Istituto Affari Internazionali. And from Canada, Rohinton Medora, President of Center for International Governance Innovation. And from India, Sanjoy Josh, ORF. And from Brazil, Carlos Ivan Simonsen Leal, President of Getulio Vargas Foundation. And from Singapore, we have Ambassador KengYong, Executive Deputy Chairman of S.Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Ambassador KengYong is here with us today already, and I'm not sure if this announcement is heard by Mr. Volker Perthes on behalf of the special agencies of UN, who is a special representative for Sudan and head of the United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan. And then Mr. Yasushi Kudo, representative of Genron NPO, is going to moderate this session again. Thank you very much. Really long time no see. Good morning, good evening. I hope this matches time zone of us, at least some of you. I'm so delighted to be able to see you this way. Some of you have been already been with us in the last session, so it's been already many hours, and we are going to start the longest session of the day now. And this discussion this time is going to cover the biggest theme for us. That means the international cooperation and democracy in the world, but also liberal economy is also another topic in the same context. How to restore all of them is a discussion theme of this session. And I added, we as democracy, how should the democracies around the world work together, all these restorations? But I don't know if this addition is necessary. But an international cooperation is really essentially questioned about currently, that is for sure. So democracies, our nations need to be really owners of this particular question. This is my view. So we need to have ownership as a democracy. That's the reason why I added we democracies in the topic of this discussion. So in order to process this topic, we are going to hear for about 8 minutes on each from each speakers, and then we would like to have a discussion all together. I think this has been the instruction given to you already by our secretariat. So I think this, it is early morning in the US. Sorry for this tough time to log us. And Mr. Lindsay, long time no see. In my virtual background, you see a cherry blossom. Well, this is a kind view almost here today in Japan. I just would like to give you the mood. This will be the full bloom in a few days, like this background. So James Lindsay, Dr. Lindsay, over to you first.
Thank you very much, Kudo-san. It is terrific to see you, even if only virtually. Thank you very much for showing me the cherry blossoms as they are in Tokyo. As you know, Japan, more than a century ago, gifted the United States, gifted Washington, D.C., with a large number of cherry trees. So in about 2 weeks, I'll be seeing those cherry trees blooming here in Washington, D.C. As always, I regret that we can't meet in person. I do look forward to when we can get together again. I want to congratulate you, Kudo-san, on putting the conference together in the virtual world, since we couldn't do it in person. I also want to send my greeting out to my fellow panelists. I know I will learn a lot from what everybody has to say here today, as I have so often in the past. Now, I have to say, Kudo-san, as always, you have put forth a rich and provocative set of opening questions to guide our conversation. And I will tell you, as I told you in the past, there's no way I can give justice to each questions in my, what I was told was supposed to be 5 minutes of remarks. So if I may, Kudo-san, I simply want to sketch out sort of 3 broad points speaking to each of the discussion questions that you posed. And the first point would be that COVID-19 shows what we have known for a very long time, and that is that we have far less international cooperation than we need. The reality of our global over that problem. Now, cooperation, of course, doesn't appear magically. Somebody has to lead the effort. The reality is that few countries have the requisite economic power to do so. For the past 75 years, the United States has played that role, but Washington clearly damaged its leadership credentials with the Iraq War, the great financial crisis, and Trump's America First. I think it's very clear that Biden is hoping to restore the mantle of global leadership for the United States, but it's not clear who is going to follow or what issues they will follow him on. By the same token, China, for whatever ambitions it might have, lacks a track record of effective global leadership. I think it is safe to say that countries understandably fear that Beijing isn't looking to create an environment in which everyone can succeed, but rather an environment that guarantees that China will succeed. And that basic tension leads into the second point I want to make, which is that cooperation is going to be most likely where Washington and Beijing agree. But it looks like the US-China rivalry is going to limit that scope for agreement. Now, I should say that here in the United States, there's a broad consensus that China is not seeking to integrate itself into the existing world order, but rather looking to overturn it. And I think if you talk to people from China, it's pretty clear that China's increased assertiveness in recent years reflects its calculation that the United States and the West more broadly is declining. Now, these two conflicting worldviews set the stage for great tensions. And I think Secretary of State Tony Blinken summed it up from the American perspective quite nicely, which is that the US relationship with China will be competitive where it should be, collaborative where it can be, and adversarial where it must be. Now, I think how the jockeying between Washington and Beijing turns out is going to depend not just on what Washington and Beijing do, but clearly on the choices that America's many friends, partners, and allies make in the coming years. Now, in my conversations with many people overseas, their view is they're hoping that Washington won't call on them to choose between China and the United States. I will simply note they may not, however, be so lucky as to avoid that choice. Third and closing point I want to make is that you were quite right, Kudo-san, to ask the question about democracy, because democracy is in trouble around the world. I know that earlier this month, Freedom House released its annual report on the health of democracies and found that for the 15th consecutive year, we are witnessing democratic backsliding. Freedom House calls it the long democratic recession, a recession that it says is deepening. Now, there are a lot of explanations for why this is happening. We can get into it during the discussion if we want. I'll simply note that reversing democratic backsliding is a major policy challenge. However, it's also a policy challenge that is fundamentally solved only through self-help. Now, more resilient democracies may be able to help their backsliding friends on the margins. Ettore and Volker and Thomas may want to talk about what's happening within the European Union, particularly toward members in Central Europe. But I will note that in general, countries like people resent being told what to do, meaning that external criticism can often be counterproductive. Now, I don't have any great wisdom as to whether self-help is going to work. I will simply say here in the United States, where democracy is really under test and under stress, the Biden administration is seeking to demonstrate that government can resolve major social problems, of which COVID-19 is simply one. And it wants to do so in ways that show that no one is left behind, that in fact democracy works. Now, of course, that goal is easy to set forth. It will be very difficult to achieve. And so we will see what happens in the coming months and years here in the United States. On that point, Kudo-san, I'm going to end and cede the floor.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。次ゴマルさん、さっきゴマルさんいなかったんで、ジョシさんが寂しい思いをしてましたが、ゴマルさん参加していただいてありがとうございました。じゃあゴマルさん、ちょっとお発言お願いします。
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon from Paris. Very pleased to see all of you. Thank you, Kudo-san, for this organization. Congratulations for the very beautiful flowers behind you. Very sorry for this morning, but there was a confusion in my schedule, so I apologize for that. Well, a few words about this session on democracy. And especially on the tenets of democracy, we were asked to think about that. Usually we say that democracy is based on elections, freedom of speech, but I think that more importantly, on separation of powers between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial powers. And we face a regime, which is a Chinese one, which is precisely based on fusion of powers in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that it should be the starting point of our discussion to try to understand how the model of democracy is now directly challenged by the Chinese model, openly, I would say. Previously, we had some challenges coming from, especially in Europe, from so-called illiberal democracies, which made a particular use of media, for instance. But I think that the challenge presented by China is from another nature, because it's now a sort of tension between two models. And I think that we are in a confrontation of models right now. That leads me to my second initial point. I think we all observed a sort of shift during the last 2 decades. If you remember 20 years ago, we were, through the US administration, at that time the Bush administration, the West, and especially the US, with some deep differences, for instance, in Germany or in France, the US was promoting democracy, promotion of democracy, was at that time the slogan. And 2 decades after, so it was a very offensive posture, I would say. It was supposed to use to justify the intervention in Iraq, for instance, or in Afghanistan. 2 decades after, democracy are on a very defensive position. And I think that this shift should be analyzed properly. The first country which reacted in ideological terms to the promotion of democracy was Russia, with this concept of sovereign democracy, which emerged approximately 2004, 2005. And I think it's interesting to have this recall, given the attitude taken by the Biden administration, which is to challenge simultaneously China and Russia. And a question I have, and I would be glad to discuss with all my colleagues, is it the proper way to act in the current context? To try to challenge simultaneously China and Russia? Is it just feasible? That leads me to the the 2 other points I would like to make. The first one, in line with your question, Kudo-san, about international cooperation, and the second one about the US-China conflicts. Regarding the first one, as you said in your driving questions, there is a sense of vulnerability of international cooperation related to the COVID-19. In my view, I do think that the issue is less in the interaction between states and international organizations, for one obvious reasons. When you have some sanitary problem, you don't turn first to the WHO, but you turn first to your national authorities. Having said that, I do think that the real issue is much more in the interfaces or the interactions between the states and the big companies able to invest massively. And on that, I think that we should think. I mean, it's very fascinating to see how an effort in terms of investments for the vaccine, for instance, could have been driven, could have been oriented by one administration. And that there is a big difference between what was done in London, in Washington, by comparison with other European capitals, for instance. And for me, when I think about international cooperation, once again, I think we are very much focused on the United Nations system for good reasons, but the real issue is much more, in my view, for the relation between states and big companies able to have massive investment today in the sanitary field, tomorrow or today also in the environmental field. The second point you have to think about US-China conflict, in my view, and that's an argument I developed in my published in January, I do think that China and the US are currently subordinating their risk people and climate policies to their realities. And that's a big issue for all of us, because we continue, especially in Europe, think in terms of public goods, whereas Beijing and Washington are using that in their strategic rivalries, in my opinion. Second, I think that many countries do not want to be trapped by this rivalry between the US and China, even if there are no alliance system with the US. I think that there is something very important at the time being. It is this notion of having a club of democracies. For instance, this notion of D-10, which has been so often discussed between us since many years. But what is much more important in my view, it is this notion, political, ideological notion, with the notion of T10, technology 10, this idea that in fact there is a link between the democratic regimes, the language countries, and the use they can have of technologies. In fact, our technology has already impacted democracy. I mean, technologies is now completely widespread in the economic activities and more at the core of the political activities. Just a quick reminder, 2 days before his departure, President Trump was censored by the systemic platforms. That's an issue for all of us when we do believe in freedom of expression, for instance. That leads me to my final points. I think that we are facing two big problems. The first one is our belief on the linkage between market economy, technological progress, and public and individual liberties. This belief, on which all of us, I think, will join, is very seriously challenged right now. Because we can see that the technological progress is possible in countries, in advance in countries like China. And that leads to my final point. I think that to continue to speak about a democracy not on a pure defensive posture is clearly related to our ability to rule, and especially in terms of crisis. I stop there.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。さっきのリンゼさんも今、503さんも非常になんていうんですか、私が考えてるっていうか、思ってることにちょっと直接言っていただいて、非常に感謝します。リンゼさん言われた国際協調が失われていると、重要なテストだったっていうことは本当にそう思いますね。コロナの問題は国際協調だけじゃなくて、民主主義のテストだったと思います。あと、503で言ったこと、私が本当は一番言いたいんだけど、後からゆっくり言おうと思ったんですが、国連システムっていう問題の限界というものが改めて見えてきているということは、私も思っています。ただ、さて、それをどうすればいいかという状況が今、一つ大きな論点になってきてるんじゃないかと私は思っているところです。で、今度ちょっとフォルカーさんですが、まだちょっとうまくいってないので、シンガポールのオン・ケヨンさん、どうですか？
Thank you, Kudo-san. Well, I just wanted to make 2 or 3 points regarding these questions. I have mentioned earlier this evening that the digital and internet development have been very significant in the past 2-3 decades. And the COVID-19 pandemic has brought this whole challenge of adapting to the digital and internet age in a very, very urgent manner. So I would like to urge that as we go forward, our democratic systems in the various countries should look at how we can integrate the social media, the internet and digital technologies, so that more and more people can participate in sharing their ideas and opinion, at the same time to allow credible information to be on the internet, on the social digital platform. Because as we see in Singapore, the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in many people giving different opinions about how to tackle the infection, how do we see the efficacy of the vaccination, the vaccine that have been introduced. And this basically poses serious challenge to the governments and to the scientific community, as misinformation and disinformation contribute to a very difficult time in helping the government tackle the pandemic. So my first point really is that as we see digital and internet revolution, how do we share information? How do we put out the responsible, correct information in order for citizens to make an accurate judgment, an accurate position to support policy or to express their disagreement with policy and to make changes. This is important in ASEAN, Kudo-san, because we in Southeast Asia now has a large number of young people. They are working on the internet, the digital platforms. If you look at our statistics, more than 60% of our ASEAN population under 35 years old, more than 60% under 35 years old, and they are now relying extensively on the internet, on the social media, and all the other digital platforms that they can obtain. The second point I want to make is that I think the need for cooperation among all the countries in the world is very essential. And it is how do we now apply ourselves to overcome the various difficulties in managing this pandemic, and at the same time show our commitment to the international community, international organization. Of course, there are problems with international bodies, and ASEAN has been criticized in many different forums. But what is the alternative? We have to basically cooperate, try to win the trust of everybody, and to make sure that we continue our systematic way to manage our rules, our international law. The UN has many conventions, many agreements, and even though some countries may not fully agree with all this, there must be a systematic way to change some of these problem areas or to adjust them in a manner that find consensus among the international community. So rules-based order is important, and I think as we go forward with more emerging economies and developing countries becoming more progressive and developed, we ought to look at this particular dimension, this principle of applying the rules, changing the rules to make it more adaptable and to be useful for all of us. I will just stop here now and add on to our discussion later on. Thank you, Kudo-san.
ありがとうございました。非常に積極的な意味、つまりインターネットを含めたそのものをきちっとした形で続けていく、努力が必要だったし、非常にいろんなことを教えてくれました。ポルカーさんがですね、なんかうまくいってないんだけど、一応質問は伝わってるので、ポルカーさんちょっと話してくれますか。ポルカー。
Thank you so much, Kudo-san. I did not understand what you were saying because my Japanese is still not developed, but I'm sure it was something nice. And thank you for bringing us together again. The Tokyo conference is a must in my calendar, and I'm very glad to be here again, even though only virtually, and be together with many of the colleagues. We have been together for many years under your leadership and guidance. Let me just say that things look a bit different if you work in Khartoum. It's 40 degrees centigrade and gradually getting warmer, and there's a situation, also the political situation in the world looks a little bit different if you watch it from Khartoum than when you watch it from a German think tank. So let me try to respond to your guiding questions with 4 points and in the 5 minutes we have. First, on enhancing international cooperation for the resolution of global issues, as you call it. This necessarily means multilateralism and revival of multilateralism, particularly where public goods, public global goods are concerned. This cooperation will have to include democracies as well as countries that aren't democratic. Global health, climate protection, protection of the oceans, sustainable development, equal rights for women and men, conflict resolution, peace building, international security, all that needs the buy-in of all relevant influential actors, regardless of the system of government. And if we speak of multilateral cooperation, then of course the United Nations is the embodiment of inclusive multilateralism, but practical cooperation, and some of the colleagues have said so much, will often rely on a mix of formats involving, of course, the United Nations, but also regional organizations, individuals or groups of like-minded states, and of course NGOs and the private sector. In Sudan, where I now live, anti-COVID vaccines have recently arrived thanks to the International COVAX initiative, which is an initiative that actively involves member states and WHO, the African Union, or the private-public Gavi initiative and others. And it wasn't easy, I can tell you, to get the vaccines into the country, even though COVAX helped. But vaccine nationalism, I have to say, has not been restricted to non-democratic countries. It has also been a feature in democratic ones. You do state in your guiding questions that the COVID crisis has, and I quote, highlighted the vulnerability of state-centered international cooperation. Now, I would put that a little bit differently, and I would say successful multilateralism needs strong, outward-leaning leadership, not alone, but mainly from states. We have seen over the past 4 years what the lack of leadership from both democratic and non-democratic states has done to the multilateral system. Second, you rightly mentioned in another of your guiding questions the impact of geopolitical competition on international cooperation, particularly on developing countries, and that is true. The geopolitical competition between the US and China, or the West and China, has indeed geopoliticized other domains that are of utmost importance to the developing world. You mentioned international trade yourself, but I would also stress global health. Consider mutual finger-pointing of the origins about Taiwan as an observer to the World Health Assembly, or comments on mask and vaccine diplomacy. Some of the debates look rather irrelevant if you look at them from a developing country perspective. The important thing is that vaccines arrive, and that means that Chinese or Indian or Turkish donations are as welcome as are the financial contributions to the COVAX initiative by leading Western democracies. Third point, and I feel myself in close companionship to something what the colleague said, the restoration of democracy. I would state this is mainly the task of democracies themselves. Since it's impossible to enforce democracy on a sovereign country, peer pressure is probably the way out. Peer pressure by other democratic countries, by regional communities, by alliances, or by groups of like-minded states can do a lot. And I would consider the experience of the Council of Europe, the EU, to deal with tendencies in some of their member states, where rule of law has been at the receiving end, for example. Or peer pressure by ASEAN. I would like to have Om's vision on that. I think peer pressure in ASEAN would be critical to find a way out of the crisis in Myanmar, for example. And in Sudan, where I now live, both the African Union and IGAD, both regional organizations, have played a decisive role in blocking a military takeover after the revolution 2 years ago, and both have been helping to negotiate a power-sharing agreement here that actually has set the Sudan on a path towards democracy. Now, my final point is on the relationship between democracy and peace. You were asking for that in your guiding questions, but I would add another factor, which is development. And again, I'm arguing here from my current vantage point in the Sudan, but I think that my argument applies to any other nation that exits from a long period of civil war and dictatorship. Seen from here, I can only urge both domestic stakeholders, the country level, international players, not to ignore the deep interrelationship between political transition, peacemaking, stabilization, and economic recovery. Peace agreements after a civil war are unlikely to hold without inclusive participation, without inclusive and meaningful representation of women and young people, without respect for human rights, and without the rule of law. And all these, as we know, are key ingredients of a viable democracy. Fledgling democracies will likely not stabilize without peace and security and economic recovery. And an economic recovery to boot that convinces the people that peace is also for them and not only for the elites. And economic recovery will not be achieved in post-conflict situations in developing countries without external economic support, which basically means, and that is sort of my urge, that democratic countries, despite all the economic challenges which we all face in a post-COVID environment, will still have to put their money where their mouth is. That if democratic countries want to support democracy and peace in developing countries, they must know that they will not get that for free. This includes vaccine deliveries, development aid, also humanitarian aid, or as Secretary General Antonio Guterres put it recently, quite succinctly, if you don't feed the people, you will feed new conflict. Thank you, Kudo-san.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。これで4人の方から問題提起されたんですが、これを踏まえて他の方からどんどん意見を言っていただきたいんですね。つまり問題は、我々の今日考えなきゃいけないのは、国際協調と民主主義っていうものをどういうふうに修復するかっていうことなんですが、他の方でなるべく発言するとき手を挙げる発言をしてくれると一番いいんですが、でなければ次々私の方で当てていきますが、まずどなたか発言する人いますか。皆さんの4人の方に対する質問でもいいです。じゃあグレコさんからいきますか。
Yes, thanks. Many thanks for offering me this second opportunity. I think all speakers were right in emphasizing that our point of departure should be necessarily this decline of legal democracy. This has been a trend on display for many years, and as has been stressed, all analysis and surveys converge at that conclusion. We have seen several democratization processes on which we bet in the past that are now on hold or are being reversed. Certainly, threat to freedom of expression in particular has intensified very clearly. And on the other hand, because this is the other side of the coin, social media have been widely used to erode the trust and confidence in democratic institutions. Even in Europe and US, of course, we have experienced unprecedented assaults to on democratic principles, checks and balances, and rule of law. As for the pandemic, it's probably difficult to gauge at this stage the direct effect of pandemic in terms of there have been certainly violations in response to the pandemic, and some leaders have employed the emergency to crack down on protest movement and advance their autocratic agenda. And even in Europe, in my country or other European countries, not to speak of other countries more to the east, we are discussing the excessive use of emerging powers and the difficulty in dealing with the pandemic are certainly put under pressure the institutional system in many respects. For a certain period in the first phase of the pandemic, perhaps government have benefited from the so-called rally around the flag effect. but the point is that Europe political system remains under the pressure of populist movement, and the party system themselves are now much more fragmented. There is a difficulty in forming stable and European-minded governments, and these tend to translate into problems for the institutional system itself, and with a negative impact also on the level of confidence and trust. The other point which has been stressed is very important, the competition with autocratic regimes. As you know, the Chinese Communist Party has defined the wide circulation of disease in the West as a sign of the decadence of Western democracy. I can cite an opinion pool, a survey we conducted, and there was a prevailing view that the autocratic regime were better equipped to manage problems such as the pandemic. So the pandemic experience has, in a sense, help this type of anti-Western propaganda. The most significant development we have seen recently is the new attitude of the Biden administration, which has decided to move democracy to the center of its foreign policy. Of course, this raises a number of problems because of the deterioration of image of US democracy. And the problem is how we can reconcile, in a sense, the effort that we should make to reform our own system with the idea that we should not renounce the promotion of some values, democratic values and the rule of law principle abroad. That's a delicate act to perform. And so we should discuss. I think it is right. I read a recent paper by Carnegie Endowment saying that one way it should be as candid as possible in recognizing the shortcomings of their system. We need an open debate on that, and of course we should try to find the right remedies. I tend also to be skeptical about the idea of big alliances of democracy, if this is seen as a way of promoting a global agenda, because of course we need both other countries, China, the autocratic regimes that play a big role, of course, on the world scene. So I will be very skeptical about these formats, but on the other hand, it is important that we continue to promote these formats and forums that are very important initiatives that can have an impact globally, to the extent that they are able to promote and advocate basic principles. So I will stop here.
はい、ありがとうございました。じゃあ次、どんどん発言してほしいんですが、どうしましょう。ノーヒントンさんいました。あ、ジョージさんいるな、ジョージさんいた。ジョージさん、ちょっとどうですか。
I'm very much there. Unfortunately, I cannot find the hand icon, so I couldn't raise it. So that's why I sent the message.
どうしよう、どこちょ教えて。すいません、事務局から説明します。はい、どうぞ。
No, just send a message to me. Anyway, I'll take the floor now. It's okay.
Just quick for all of you, and go to the bottom bar and find the participant. Did you find the participant? And click the participant. You will see your name or either raise your hand function.
Yeah, I can't find the hand function there. I find myself, but I don't find that. I just find a button saying mute, and it says more, and more says something else.
I think
I tried this.
No,
Yeah, I tried this, but I couldn't find the hand icon. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't
Go
matter.
to reactions and there's a hand there as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah. So if I need to speak, I'll just send a message on the chat bot. That may work better. Okay. So thank you, Kudo-san. It's good to be back in this session. I missed, of course, Thomas in the first session. I would love to hear his views on the Indo-Pacific and the French view of the Indo-Pacific. I was dying to grill him on that, but he escaped. Hi, Rohinton. Lovely seeing you. And James and Volker. It's always a pleasure listening to Volker. Kudo-san, you raised some extremely difficult questions. So I don't know, there's so much in this box that the only response many times is more questions. The pandemic has been disastrous, but no matter how disastrous it has been, what has been more shocking has been the responses of nations, both singly or as a collective, to this crisis. To combat a virus that holds borders in contempt, nations have responded by erecting borders within borders. They've erected borders for trade, technology, healthcare services, financial assistance, IPR walls around vaccines in a crisis. What is happening? So, when we start talking about the future of liberal democracies, yes, there is a big doubt on where our liberal democracies headed. And the global response of a connected, technology-led 21st century world, unfortunately, has been no better than that in the time of the Black Death. That itself raises a big question on the future of the open liberal international order, even the countries which subscribe to it. So these are questions, I think, which we need to answer. We need to confront these answers. And the year 2020 has radically affected the world and world politics, as well as affected our personal way of life. We are today seeing protests against increasing state control burst across democracies in the world. So I'll just make a couple of very short points. Thomas spoke about the importance of separation of powers in democracies. We have seen the erosion of that separation in democracies. The point is that when that separation happens, countries with weakened institutions lose the capacity or the ability to negotiate between contending interests in that democracy. And when you have weak and fragmented bargaining systems within the democratic system, it blocks rather than facilitates society's ability to adapt to technological change which we are facing, or changes forced by a crisis such as COVID. And so you're seeing this complete distrust between governments and the governed, which is only going to lead to an increase in the number of ungoverned spaces across many countries. The answers to how we get out of this rut. And as Ambassador Ong pointed out very correctly, one of the great questions of our time, this is my second point, perhaps the greatest question, is how liberty and human rights, the bedrocks of democracy, will survive the digital revolution. The genuine questions which that is facing. How will democracies, we call ourselves democracies, how will we together build the rules of the road that are going to enable this? Are we going to do it, or are we going to fragment those rules further? And we see a lot of that fragmentation happening across countries. Technology has completely disrupted our understanding of privacy. It is kind of annulled the boundary between private and public. The first it was security concerns, now the health issues, which have greatly undermined the protection of privacy and reinforce the need, which even democracies are accepting, the need for more surveillance and control. And the Genron NPO survey itself shows that there are admirers across democracies for the kind of authoritarian methods used to control the pandemic in countries like China. So to conclude, I would say that for democracies, it is important to understand that power is never about the ability to affect people's ways through the kind of coercion typical of the authoritarian states which we are seeing in countries like China, Russia, North Korea. Democratic leaders are far more effective when they get others to follow because they subscribe to the same norms. And that is both at the national level and international level. democracies, when they lose the ability to govern through the civil consensus, fall into crisis, and that is the biggest crisis that we are handling. We are finding ourselves very weak and powerless handling our fractured civil societies. So the big conversation is about depolarizing the social discourse within countries and the global discourse. That at the international level is also creating these rifts. So how do we move into that situation? I think those are some of the questions that we need to be debating. Thank you.
はい、どうもありがとうございました、ジュースさん。手を挙げる機能がかなり機能し始めてまして、3人の方が手を挙げてました。なので、その順で話をしていただきたい。まあ、シのロヒントンさん、それからあれだよね、あれだよね、サタムのニコルさんだよね、チャタムだよね。それであとゴマさんも手を挙げてますんで、その3人の方にちょっとずつ3分でお願いします。
Okay. You know, I'm listening to a conversation we've been having for some time. Thanks to your bringing us together, Kudo-san. And you know, you're posing the big question, and I'm asking myself, how do we get to where we are? And I'd say two things. We've had a quite unbalanced globalization in which financial flows were privileged and other forms of flows were less privileged. Labor flows certainly, but even the capacity of regulations to keep up with financial flows. You also had technology flows that were quite privileged. And so when you say there's a sort of decline in democracy, first of all, it's not just in the US, it is in many parts of the world. And I think a case can be made that it is because of the hollowing out of the industrial sectors in many parts of the Western world that has led to this kind of angst in parts of the population who feel left out from all of this. And so that's one point to keep in mind, is the nature of globalization. And the second, which is connected to it, but worth singling out, and many of you have, is technology, which can be used as with any technology, but certainly digital technologies, for the good or also for the not so good. And so what you find is that countries, sometimes in a well-meaning way, are harnessing the power of digital technologies through ID systems. In fact, as we've seen in COVID, through very strong tracing and tracking mechanisms to fight the pandemic in the name of the public good. But that's also slippery slope towards forms of surveillance and authoritarianism that I think we should be worried about. The other aspect of technology that I think brings us to where we are is the winner-take-all nature of it. And so if you zero in on your core question, which is what about the US and China, I'd say there's room for hope, and then there's room for pessimism. On the room for hope side, I'd say that if you look at traditional areas in which cooperation was lacking, or where there were global public bads, financial instability, climate change, global health. We cannot do these things by only talking to our friends and people we like and agree with. We have to talk to countries and people who we don't see eye to eye with. And I think, again, to use China as the proxy for that, but it's also about Russia and some other countries, you will not be able to have global macroeconomic coordination. You will not be able to have a sensible fight on climate change, and you will certainly not be able to fight the pandemic by moving into blocks. And so there's areas where we should maintain the cooperation. And I think this is a point Zhu Min made in the previous session, that there were 194 reasons for the US and China to talk, and we've taken the one area, which is trade, to not talk on anything. That doesn't make sense. So that's my sort of basket of optimism. Then we come to the pessimism, where I come back to my point about technologies, where it's not quite a zero-sum game, but it is certainly the case that digital technologies have inbuilt economies of scale. The bigger you get, the more efficient you get, and the more efficient you get, the bigger you get. And so breaking that cycle requires a form of cooperation where we're not there yet. Whether it's data governance, whether it's norms around AI, whether it's algorithmic accountability, whether it's digital taxation, we have to accept that we're not there yet. And here, I can foresee a kind of what I'd call constructive disengagement, in which the two sides sort of unravel and sort of find their own moorings. I don't think it's too simplistic to say that China simply does not believe that technology can be for democracy. Somehow the West believes that it can be used for that. But we do need to sort out issues in digital and data governance. I've talked about this in previous fora in our group and elsewhere, and then perhaps come together. But let's not let that constructive disengagement get in the way of areas where we need to be working together. So I'll stop there for now.
はい、ありがとうございました。じゃあ、ニコルソン、ニルソン・ライトさん。
Thank you very much, Kudo-san. It's great to be back and have the chance to talk about this critical issue. It seems to me that there is kind of two ways we can frame this problem in terms of the vulnerability of democratic ideas. One is the international dynamic and the backlash, the idea of democracy. I want to see that all the whole debate in the Kingdom. Belief that international institutions that claim to have democratic legitimacy are perceived to be structurally failing. And one can debate that argument, whether it's valid or not, but it's been part of the narrative. Allied to that has been the belief that past attempts to promote democracy under the rubric of the Cold War were seen as insincere, prone to abuse, prone to being exploited. One thinks of the arguments of John Mearsheimer and others. And in a similar echo to that, today in Washington Post, Elbridge Colby, one of the former architects of Trump's national security policy, has made a kind of similar argument that the United States can't be seen to be promoting democracy as a global issue because it's not only practically very difficult, but it will be necessary for the United States to participate and cooperate with authoritarian regimes. So that's a problem at the international dimension. But I think domestically, this puzzle of why democratic norms have become increasingly not only seen as unattractive to individual citizens, but actually part of the problem, I think is not immediately explained purely by material disadvantages and economic changes, whether it's the result of globalization or the perception that certain communities have been marginalized and left behind by globalization. And I'm thinking here of the work of Anne Applebaum, who in her book, Twilight of Democracy, points out in the specific case of post-Cold War Poland, how many of the individuals who were part of the liberal movement to overturn authoritarian government themselves embraced a form of intolerance and anti-liberal policy today. Now, these are members of the elite. They're not the disadvantaged. They are the so-called anywheres that David Goodhart talks about when he provides a kind of sociological explanation for why democracy is losing its purchase on the minds of populations across the world, not just in North America, but in Europe. And part of that, I think, is a much bigger challenge of modernity itself, and what I would call a revival of a politics of nostalgia, sometimes exploited by individuals for their own benefit, by national leaders, but tapping into a type of irrationalism, which we can see reflected in vaccine nationalism in my own country, for example. The popularity of the AstraZeneca vaccine, despite questions about its effectiveness, is a classic illustration of that. But there is something deeper going on, which is what evolutionary psychologists would explain as a tendency to make decisions based on instinct, on emotion, not on rational self-interest. So oddly, the case that is being made for supporting democracy by delivering better material prosperity is not really a complete solution. And you only have to look at the revival of neo-Maoist ideas in contemporary China, which clearly serves the interests of a leadership that wants to wrap itself in the Chinese flag, but more fundamentally also resonates with ordinary Chinese and younger Chinese. This, I think, is part of a global phenomenon that we don't necessarily have the immediate tools to unpack and understand. The technological challenge of social media amplifies the phenomenon, but we still don't have a really full and complete explanation for why this politics of emotion and nostalgia resonates with people. Because it seems to me that the rise of neo-fascist groups and left-wing populist organizations is tapping into a sense of disconnection, alienation, and anger that's more than just an economic issue.
どうもありがとうございます。今ずっと聞いてました。ありがとうございました。ちょっと50さんに移る前にですね、ちょっと今までの話をちょっとまとめた上で、話をじゃあどうしたらいいのかっていう話になるべく変えていきたいんですね。さっき4人の方が話したときに、オンケヨンさんはね、それなりにやっぱり一つの対策を私に言ってました。ただ、一方で50さんとリンゼさんが言った問いかけが私にとっては非常にずっと考えていることだったので、ちょっとその対策を考える上で、私がどう思っているかということを簡単に一言でちょっと言いたいことがあるんですね。でそれはですね、国際協調の今のコロナがテストだったんじゃないかという話なんですが、私はずっと考えてて、国家が対立した構造の中で、国連システムが世界共通のに達するのは非常に難しい。そんな気がすごくしました。で例えば2014年のエボラの時はですね、国連はそのエボラのミッションを作り、安保理でもそれに対してそれが世界の平和とか安全の脅威だということで決議をして軍まで派遣するわけですね。それはアフリカだったからですよ。しかし今回被害があったのは、まさにそういう戦後のシステムを作った保健システムを含めたアメリカやイギリスとか先進国がまさにその被害があってるわけですね。しかも中国というものとの対立構造を抱えていると、つまりリーダーシップをそういう状況の中で発揮できないという状況が非常にあったわけですね。で私は国家の対立化になり、その主体的なリーダーシップを発揮する国が全く機能しない状況になったときに、じゃあどうしたらいいんだと、こういう危機が起こったときですね、という問題がやっぱり非常に頭にあるわけですね。さっき50さんが言ってたのは、それに対する一つのヒントで、国連システムの中で国家だけではなくて企業とか言ってましたが、つまりいろんなアクターっていうものをもう一回ここでやっぱり考えなきゃいけない局面に来ているのか、それとも私、明石康っていうのとこれずっと議論したんですが、国連に絶対的に期待するんじゃなくて、国連をまず我々が使いこなすと、つまり主体的な意思を持っている人たちがですね、という発想にならなきゃだめだっていう結論には一応なったんですが、なんかそういうふうな今単なる国連システムに依存するんじゃなくて、それを使いこなしながら危機を乗り越えるっていう形に来なければ、何かの新しい変化が始まらないんじゃないかということを私はまず一つ思ったわけですね。それからもう一つ皆さんに聞きたいんだけど、私は今回の問題は権威主義国対民主主義の問題じゃないと。結局統治の在り方の統治が市民にどう信用されているかだけの問題だと思ってたんですね。ずっとそう思ってたし、そう言ってました、講演でも。ただ結果を見るとですね、圧倒的な差があるわけですね。ベトナム、統計、本当のデータが本当なのかわからないんですが、ベトナムは25人しか死んでないわけですね。シンガポールも恩恵要素いますから、確か30人とかそんなレベルですよ。日本は頑張ったと言っても8000人、9000人ぐらいが亡くなってます。圧倒的な違いがあるのですよ。これはなぜなんだろうと。でそれはシステムの問題の本質的な違いではなくて、民主統治の仕組みがきちっと機能してないと。 という問題だと思うんですね。多分日本でもですね、国民はほとんど政府を信用してない状況になってて、自分で自分の身を守るしかないという状況になってるわけですね。だから非常にソーシャルディスタンスもして被害が少ない状況です。ただ政府のそういう政策を考えている人たちからとよく議論したんですが、公衆衛生、こういう感染症っていうのはやることのベストプラクティスはもう決まってるんだと。つまりそれは中国や先進国が言ってることとほぼ近いのですね。感染者を早期に発見して、そして感染ルートをきちっと抑えて、それを遮断して、隔離して、それで適切な医療をすると。なぜじゃあ民主国はそれが、民主システムはそれがきちっとできなかったのか。日本の問題で言えば、日本は SARS とかいろんな経験不足からそういう準備ができてなかった。ただ一方で、そういう状況ができてない中で市民にそれを説得する自信を統治側がなかったという問題がありました。つまり主権者側と統治の民主システムの問題が今非常にテストを受けているのではないかと私は思っているわけですね。つまりそれを変えない限り同じ問題が起こってくるのではないかと。それがちょっと私の漠然とした問題意識なわけですね。だから民主主義の修復っていうのは皆さんが言ってるように、さっき皆さん言ってました、それぞれの国で自国の民主主義システムをもう一回ちょっと直さなきゃいけないんだろうという状況に来てるんじゃないか、それがテストの結果だったんじゃないかと思ってるわけですね。ただ国際協調テストの答えはどうすればいいのかっていう問題はまだやっぱりいろんな議論があってもいいと思ってるんで、そういうことに関してもしかよければ皆さんの議論を私はぜひ聞きたいと思っています。ということで、あまり司会者が言うとよくないんですが、ちょっとそういう問題意識でした。それで、小丸さん、よろしくお願いします。
Thank you, Kudo-san, for your thoughts. I would like, in fact, to react to what you have just said and also to what was said by Sun Choi. I apologize, Sun Choi, for having missed the previous session, but precisely, I would like to link the previous session with the ongoing one and to think about the link we can establish historically between sea power and democracy. The previous session was on Indo-Pacific. I would have explained, what is discussed between Germany, the UK, France, Italy, Spain for the Indo-Pacific right now. There are many discussions, but my point is broader. If you see the type of leadership we had with the British leadership and afterwards the US leadership, it's very based on sea power. There is a direct link, in my opinion, between the political regime, the sea power, the trade. In fact, globalization, first of all, is maritimization. And the question is how to secure maritime exchanges, historically. We have a French poet, I'm sure that Carlos knows him. Comme libre, toujours tu chériras la mer. Free man, all the time you will cherish sea. And I think it's important in the current context to have this background of sea power given the Chinese ambitions, because in my view, we should think about the link between freedom of speech, freedom of navigation, freedom of movements, and the fact that we are less and less capable to secure this type of links and that China will be more and more capable to do so is a direct challenge for democracies, in my view.
はい、どうぞ続けて、どなたかどんどん発言してもらいたいんですが。カルロスさん、手を挙げていただいてありがとうございます。
Carlos, you are muted.
Mute.
I didn't listen to the name of a poet because of Zoom. The sound was not good at that moment.
Charles Baudelaire.
Ah, oui.
Baudelaire.
Anyway, Baudelaire has written a very, very famous poem called The Flower of Evil, La Fleur du Mal. I hope we are not entering the time of flowers of evil. Anyway, it's quite obvious that the US dollar depends on the US Navy. It is controlled naval sea lanes that allows the dollar to happen to be the reserve currency of the world. Without that, the American economy deleverages. And this is exactly why the discussion in the South China Sea is very important. Because if China manages to exclude the US from that area and create a renminbi area to substitute that, then the US dollar would be the reserve currency of Latin America, maybe some countries in the Persian Gulf for a while, and it would have to deleverage. And this would be very dangerous because that means that who is going to pay for the American naval forces? Who's going to pay? It's an impossibility from a fiscal point of view. You would have a rebalance of the world in a very short period. But going back to the democracy issues, I think that we are all shocked by one thing. Why is the middle class behaving like it is? Why is it voting extreme left, extreme right? Why? Especially in the West. The reason is very simple. Has not been enjoying the ride in the last 20, 25 years. In the US, where it's comparatively very well compared to other middle classes, its income hasn't grown in real terms. So, without the support of a strong middle class that had hopes of a continuous improvement in the standard of living, democracies become more fragile. We have to consider that. European solution is to increase social expenditure. It seems that the UK is a little bit separated from that now, and it thinks otherwise. The US, well, it has been exporting its recessions to the rest of the world for a while, but its capacity to do that is becoming weaker. So we add that to the internet phenomenon, where you get messages all day long disturbing people, extreme measures, explanations of why, wrong explanations usually, of what is happening. And put on that a third effect. Real democracy also has, in the long term, to have a balanced budget, a budgetary process that sustains everything. And because of political cycles, we are not doing that. So three factors are acting, which are very, very complicated to deal with. And my opinion is that, well, it is not a no-win scenario, but it is a very difficult scenario, and you have to reinforce education. First, you show me that my time is finished, so I stay here.
今、カルロさんの言ってることは非常に重要で、続きも聞きたかったんですが、ルールを守ってくれてどうもありがとうございました。後から聞きたい。 じゃあ、なんだっけ、ニルソン・ライトさん。
Thanks to Carlos for his, I think what seems prima facie a very persuasive argument. But at the same time, absolute living conditions for the middle classes have steadily gone up over time. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. Yeah, you can hear me? Carlos, it seems as if you can't hear me. I'm not sure. Anyway, what I'm trying to emphasize is that we can see real benefits in absolute terms. Now, the relative position of the middle class may, in relation to populations in East Asia, have experienced a relative decline. But it's striking if you look at some of the key debates over immigration, and I think that's true in the UK, it's also true in the United States, look at the debate over the border. In terms of the impact on people's lives, it's the perception that these represent a problem rather than actually representing a problem. And I think one of the challenges that we have to unpack is along with the rise in populism, is a rise in parochialism, a tendency for increasingly domestic populations to look inwards, in contrast to the elites that are seeking to build and reinforce and extend international institutions. Paradoxically, we're seeing with the current China administration a willingness to weaponize history and to reinterpret history in ways that are seemingly counterintuitive. So Rana Mitter, for example, has recently argued that we see in Beijing now a Chinese leadership willing to cite the experience of the KMT government in those early critical years of the Cold War as being a bona fide member of the international community, one of the states that was a formative player in shaping the international system, making an argument for international engagement. The challenge, it seems to me, is that even if there are very important mechanisms through, for example, maritime access and an open seas, how do you persuade public opinion to actually believe that it's in their interests? How do you persuade individual voters to believe that they can be both global citizens and at the same time with a secure sense of national identity, particularly when it's framed in this weaponized historical way? And we saw that with Donald Trump, the attempt to appropriate symbols from the Civil War, attempt to rewrite America's own historical narratives. This seems to me a common problem. We see it very powerfully between Japan and South Korea. And we don't have an easy mechanism for disincentivizing politicians to reach for that easy tool with which to strengthen their positions at home. And so there's almost a competitive race on the part of individual leaders, some of it well-intentioned, some of it manipulative, but it's distorting the way in which states interact with one another. And I think we're missing a key factor if we fail to appreciate how much that resonates with ordinary voters, even in my own country. Boris Johnson's ability to present himself, however implausibly, as a latter-day Winston Churchill is part, I wouldn't say it's all, but it's part of his appeal with certain sectors of the British electorate. And I think we have to find a way of understanding why that is so powerful.
Most true.
フォルカーさん、聞こえるかな、僕の話が。フォルカーさんって。フォルカーさん。
Well, yes, trying to get my video on. Thank you, Kudo-san. I just sort of wanted to intervene from the geographical sideline, as it were, to what I heard some of you saying, which had an undertone of saying that democracy has perhaps become unattractive. And sort of from the vantage point of the South, of a poor developing country in a post-conflict situation, I would say this is simply not the case. Maybe in some of the industrialized democracies, people have become so much used to freedoms, to rights, that they do no longer see the value of it. I'm living in a country where people are asking for all of this, what we take in the North, what we take for granted. They're asking for human rights, they're asking for rule of law, they are asking for freedom of expression, and they are also asking for a constitutional process, and they are asking for elections. And what applies to Sudan applies to Uganda, and applies to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it applies to Myanmar, as we see right now, and to many other countries. So I think sometimes, sort of from the northern perspective, we have to see that what in northern industrialized democracies countries have achieved and are taking for granted is something which in other countries people really, really do aspire to. So I think here is a dual message for me. The one is that in established or saturated democracies, like in Europe or in Northern America, there's certainly a need to protect democracies and its inner structures, refreshing it, revitalizing it, making sure that people see the benefit of it. But at the same time, if democracies want to support young democracies, you don't get it for free. Young democracies don't need only advice, they also need material support. And maybe democracies have to think about, established democracies, saturated democracies, have to think about how they do not only make their values attractive to others, but also make their countries still attractive as partners to others, and not only to migrants, which many the established democracies do not want. And then I think I'm speaking a little bit here in the same direction as Rohinton did. I think we have to distinguish between the democracy agenda of democratic countries, which is, as I try to say, both inward bound as well as outward bound in terms of support. But you should distinguish between this democracy agenda and the global public goods agenda. And I very much would subscribe to what Rohinton said, and I'm only paraphrasing him. We cannot fight the pandemic by building blocks or by retreating into blocks. And the same applies, of course, for other public global goods. Thank you.
どうもありがとうございました。続けて、誰か手を挙げる人いないかなと思って見てるんです。そろそろ林勢さん何か言うタイミングじゃないですか。林勢さんお願いします。ミュート。
My apologies. Thank you, Kudo-san. I finally discovered where the raised hand icon was. It was in the last place that I clicked. I have a lot of reactions to the conversation we had this morning, but perhaps I want to begin with your note about the disillusionment in Japan, about how the government has handled the pandemic. And I guess it's a matter of, where you stand depends upon what you see. From an American point of view, the Japanese government has been incredibly effective in dealing with the pandemic. The death toll in the United States is roughly 30 times what it is in Japan. And I realize if you're in Japan, you look at South Korea, New Zealand, and you feel you're falling behind. But obviously, I think for a number of countries have done better than Japan. A lot more and far worse. And this gets me to the point that I don't think we should leave people with the impression that somehow democracies have failed with coronavirus. I think the response among democratic countries has varied. And as you dig into it, there are lots of reasons why that would be the case. And partly it's because in many countries don't have the benefit of being islands that protect them from incoming people. Partly, you think of Italy, which the virus became endemic before Italians knew it was there, and that creates a whole different set of issues. That's point one. Point number two is, I think when we talk about the lack of cooperation, we can't overlook the fact that the Chinese government knew what was happening before everyone else and basically hid a fair amount of information, not just from the World Health Organization, but from other governments. And this gets us back to the fundamental point we began at, cooperation in dealing with transnational global problems really depends upon the willingness of the most powerful countries to be willing to act. And here we had a case of a country that clearly frustrated efforts to do something. The United States, under the leadership of Donald Trump, then proceeded to make matters worse in how it handled it. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that it was really sort of China that, at least initially in terms of reacting to the outbreak of coronavirus, hampered multinational efforts to stem the disease, largely by misleading the rest of the world in withholding information. Final thing I want to challenge is, or just raise, a number of people have mentioned the issue of the Biden administration having a values-based foreign policy and pursuing democracy. And I'm, at the end of the day, not persuaded that that is actually the commitment the Biden administration has made. Certainly the packaging of American foreign policy under Joe Biden has changed. On many of the key issues, I'm not sure that the actual policies themselves have changed. Let's just take sort of the two big issues. One is China. I think the consensus in the United States is that the United States has to stand up to a more aggressive, assertive China. That's held by Democrats and Republicans. And the only argument is about what's the best way to do that. Likewise, US policy toward Russia, I would say, is bipartisan. There's not much difference between the official policy of the US government under Joe Biden than under Donald Trump. Now, of course, the presidents differ. Obviously, Donald Trump could not find a bad word to say about Vladimir Putin, whereas Joe Biden just said he was a killer. But I think that in many ways, the continuity in American foreign policy shouldn't be overlooked. And I'll just make one last point, if I may, which goes back to Tomas' really interesting provocation at the top. And that is, can Western countries really afford to drive Russia into the arms of China? And is there some way to sort of, I hate using this phrase, reset relations with Russia? I don't see any effort here in Washington to do that, but I accept Tomas' observation that current policy may be counterproductive over the long run.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。続けて、誰だろう。どうですか？ということは、私がまた当てますが。グレコさん手を挙げた？グレコさん手を挙げた。グレコさん。よろしくお願いします。
Just to, of course, to respond to James. The fact that the Biden administration perhaps is not turning Wilsonian, and that's a good news, would be a good news for Europeans always being very skeptical and critical of Wilsonian turns in the US foreign policy. But the point is, the impression is, for instance, the problem of human rights in China, for instance, continues to be a focus of attention, let's say, of the US administration. And there is the problem of the body of sanctions approved by the previous administration. It's unclear what decision the current administration will take in this regard. So there is a certain uncertainty. We know that in any case, the administration is still working on the reshaping, on forging the new strategy towards China. And so there is a certain uncertainty at the moment. We know, of course, as I think one of the key, I don't remember who exactly, the prominent figures in the administration said the relations with China will remain the key, the litmus test for US, and this applies also to transatlantic relations. On the one hand, the fact that relations with China is now increasing, drifting towards confrontation is a source of concern. There seems to be also the risk of military conflict now more than in the past. And but at the same time, the US is interested, as is Europe, of course, in maintaining and preserving room for cooperation on many issues, those that have been already mentioned several times. So that will be a very delicate balance act to perform, and so it's at the moment unclear how we can reconcile and keep distinct these two tracks. What can be said, and then Europe, in my view, European countries are not going to align themselves with the confrontational course towards China. Very reluctant to do that, but at the same time, there is a growing concern about the risk of technological dominance, and we have witnessed an alignment to some extent of Europe with US in this sense, but to the extent Europe is willing to follow US in a technological confrontation with China, that remains to be seen. It's rather certain, I would say. I would just add consideration. I think Carlos is perfectly right in emphasizing the social economic factors which have debilitated and undermined democracy. In my previous intervention, I insist in particular on the difficulty we have in preserving our welfare system. In addition to the difficulty the middle class have experienced in the last 2 decades, I would insist also on the general trend towards a polarized social and economic structure in our societies, and also the huge differences and growing difference between urban areas and rural areas, which are made very difficult to have a common political discourse, has contributed a lot to polarizing the political scene. And this has become really a problem in also finding forms of bipartisanship, of a convergence between the main political parties, and have a huge impact on the capacity to preserve a political debate, climate trust also in our institution, given the deep divisions and the pressures we have experienced from also populist movements.
どうもありがとうございます。手を挙げている方が結構いらっしゃるので、ジョシさん、お願いします。
I have a short question. It's not a statement. I'm just asking a short question. And the question is really addressed to James, Volker, Thomas, and Greco. So the transatlantic relationship was always under some strain, but Trump really put it through the ringer. Just wrung it dry. Now, how do you see this getting back on track? Is it really going to get back on track as to what it was when we start talking of this great concert of democracies, people coming together. Is the transatlantic consensus going to revive, or are we going to keep on seeing fissures, independent fissures emerge across the Atlantic, which I think surfaced during Trump's time? How easy it is going to rebuild this relationship? I have my doubts.
どうします？その質問に答える前に2人もう一人発言してもらえますか、先に。じゃあなんだっけ、ニルソン・ライトさん、ちょっと短めでお願いします。3分で。その後ちょっと皆さんに聞きますので。
I have another question, actually, rather than an observation, and it's also directed at James. You talk about the Biden administration's sort of declaratory policy on democracy. How much of this do you think is shaped by a sense that democracy is imperiled at home, given the authoritarian turn in the Republican Party? How much of the desire to use a global platform to create a new broader constituency of international actors supporting democracy is an attempt to shore up democracy at home? And then to Kudo-san, I was really struck by your opinion poll demonstrating that there is a decline in confidence in American leadership. And yet we're seeing in Japan, amongst younger politicians, diet representatives, increasingly an outspokenness on the values questions. Potentially devising a kind of Magnitsky Act-style approach to human rights violations in Xinjiang, much more close identification with Hong Kong. The 2+2 meetings involved a very assertive position by Japan on the status of Taiwan. Is this a kind of politicians, or is it being used instrumentally as a way of clipping China's feathers, if you like, of trying to restrain it by using the values issue as a way of undermining its political position? Thank you.
じゃあちょっとジェームス、リンゼさん、ちょっと質問が来てますんで、ちょっとお願いします。
I am happy to do so, Kudo-san. Let me take John's question first. I would say, to some extent, no doubt, concerns about the health of American democracy is influencing how members of the Biden administration think about democracy. I don't, however, think that the Biden people think that what they do overseas is going to repair democracy here at home. Though I will note what they're trying to do, getting back to the issues you raised about people feeling they've been left behind by globalization. They've made quite a lot out of this phrase of a foreign policy for the middle class. It's not exactly clear what that means, but I think a lot of the messaging is in essence trying to say, we understand that not everybody has benefited from American growth over the last several decades. I don't think the solutions to that lie in American foreign policy, because I don't think it was American foreign policy that caused the problems to begin with. And this is why this reconciliation bill here in the United States, the $1.9 trillion stimulus and relief package, is going to be so critical, because it's aimed at really trying to address some of those issues. Sunjoy asked, I think, what's the most important question of all, which is the fundamental assumption of the Biden foreign policy that America can sort of bring back its traditional friends, partners, and allies in common cause to build a better world, a reasonable assumption to make. And again, I don't want to begin either by assuming that somehow we can step into the same river twice. We can't. Things have happened. Countries have moved on. Events have taken place. Nor do I want in any way to idealize what the transatlantic relationship has looked like over the last 75 years. There have been lots of issues that divided the United States from its European allies and divided the European allies among themselves. I don't think we need to recount them here. But I do think that the real question for the Biden administration is, can it succeed in its bid to try to get other countries, particularly in Europe, to cooperate more, not to confront China in a military sense. I don't think there's any significant belief in Washington that European allies either have the capacity or the intention to become really active in East Asia, but rather, particularly on economic issues, to form common cause, to resist what is likely to be the Chinese strategy of divide and conquer, to try to curtail the abuses of sort of the state capitalist model of the Chinese. And I think that is a question that we shall see whether it's or not. You can obviously find reasons why individual European countries might like some of what President Biden is offering, but dislike other aspects. Obviously, Berlin is not happy with the administration's position on Nord Stream 2. My sense is that President Macron of France is still wedded to his notion of strategic autonomy and quite reasonably doesn't want to, in essence, have French foreign policy toward China tied to decisions made in Washington. But again, this is what diplomacy is for, to see if you can figure out issues on which you can, in fact, forge common cause.
はい、ちょっとじゃあ50さんどうですか。50さん手を挙げてます。
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Kudo-san. Would like to react to the question raised by Sunjoy and also to what was just said by Ettore and James. Well, from a European point of view, you know, obviously the Biden election is good news. We remember, you know, that President Trump characterized the EU as a foe in terms of trade policy, for instance. The attitude of the Biden administration is much more positive. There is no possible comparison, in a sense, in terms of attitude, of diplomatic attitude. So that's good news from a European point of view. Having said that, there are deep risks of disatlanticism, to use some a notion, you know, coined, for instance, by someone like Rawi Abdullah, on two main fields, in fact. First of all, sanctions as main instruments of foreign policy. And a second, also maybe a wish, which is more or less explained, for instance, by people like Wes Mitchell or Thomas de Maizière, to make NATO pivot towards Asia and against China, to put things bluntly. And there will be some reluctance to do so, obviously, in Europe. I think at the time being, you know, seated in Europe, and when you see what is done by the Biden administration, it's very impressive in domestic terms, you know, the stimulus, what is done for the middle classes, the vaccination campaign. There is a big shift, which once again is seen as very positive compared to the Trump administration. Having said that, you know, in the field of foreign policy, very tough on China, very tough on Russia, very tough on Iran. Isn't it too much for the US? And on that, I think, you know, that's something we should discuss. Last point, coming back to your initial question, Sunjoy, about Indo-Pacific, you know, it is something on which we work a lot, as I said, but we should also think about Indo-Pacific not only, you know, regarding China Sea, which is obviously the main part, I would say, the center of gravity, but also, you know, for Europeans, there is this idea of a possible segmentation of Indo-Pacific to be useful and to try to contribute to a collective security in the Indo-Pacific, broadly speaking. I have to mention, for instance, Mozambique Channel or west coast of Africa, for instance, which is obviously much more in the area of interest of Europeans for obvious reasons. Also possible South Pacific for some of them. So I stop there to say, I do think that there is a real deep improvement of the transatlantic relation right now. It's not too difficult after 4 years of President Trump, but I don't see a comeback to the, I would say, traditional transatlanticism right now.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。次、カロルさん手挙がってます。
So, I have a question to anyone who wants to answer. Let me put my point. Biden was elected, and before he became, he got his position as president on the 20th of January. Europe signed a trade agreement with China. That, of course, is most likely against the best American interest. And it was done before Biden could protest as president, because he wasn't president yet. He was a president-elect. That clearly shows that after the Trump period, American and European interests have diverged. Somehow, not completely, but somehow. Let us not forget that Europe and the US have competing energy matrices on the side of demand. Europe has always been, in a certain sense, contained by the US because the US Navy controlled the Persian Gulf. Let us not forget 1956, the invasion of Egypt by Israel and France and England, when US and Russia, on a very strange move, said, get out of there. So, and that after 1956, the decline of a pound as an international reserve currency came because the British Navy left the Persian Gulf. So, interests have diverged, and so have world proportions of GDP. After the war, the US was 60-something, now it's 25, Europe is 25, China is where it is, 16 or so. So you have competing economic blocks with diverging interests. It is therefore very natural that the US elects two countries as major opponents. One is quite obvious, it's China. It has to contain China. It has to give an example to all its allies in the Southeast Asia region. And it has to be very hard with Russia. Why? Because it has to make Europeans think about their alliance with Russia regarding the gas and natural gas and other things. Europeans, on the other hand, consider Russia as a natural extension of a white man's realm in the world. So this is an interesting thing. So what we are seeing are not mistakes from the American administration. We are seeing is a very sophisticated game being played, contrary to what was being played before. Trump played an unsophisticated game, and Biden is making bets. Some of them may be strong bets, difficult bets, but nevertheless, they are not completely wrong. He hasn't yet said what he wants from India, which is a third card on this very important game. The rest is mostly irrelevant. South America, Africa, it's not the big pawns on this game. They are not big pawns. So this is the game that is evolving. So, and it mixes economics and geopolitics again, and of course, military strength is there. But this is a game. It's not a game to provoke a war. Quite on the contrary, I believe it's a game to avoid a situation where you could be pushed into a war. I would like to see if I'm crazy or if the reactions, how do you feel about this?
Hi. どうもちょっと時間がなくなる。フォルカー今のフォルカーさんよければそれについても答えてもらえばいいんですけど、他の人もちょっと発言してください。もうあまり時間がないです。フォルカーさんお願いします。
Thank you, Kudo-san. I can understand my name even in Japanese, but that is sort of the only thing what I unfortunately understand from what you are saying. But still, let me try to get in here on what I heard from my colleagues or some of them. I think the simple idea of getting back to, as someone had said, the traditional transatlantic relationship will not fly because it supposes that we are in a traditional world and we are not. The world has changed. Now, I'm recusing myself from commenting on the policies of individual countries, but what I certainly can say is that the divergences between Europe and the United States in the past 4 years over things like the Paris Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, the Arms Trade Treaty, the WTO, the WHO, and many other international regimes and institutions, that has not been good to the world, because it meant that countries that are able to do so were not taking leadership in the world. If the US and Europe are on different pages here, they will not together take leadership. So even if some of them try, it will be with only half the force, and other countries have not in the world issues where the US and Europe fell out with one another. So the question for me is a renewed transatlantic relationship. Would it simply be there to build a bloc, or will it, as I hope, be there to take the leadership on global issues as well as on international security and peace? And that includes a bit of, as difficult as it may be, trying to seek consensus or even unity, particularly among the P5 in the Security Council. What those of us who are working in post-conflict countries or in developing countries are seeing is that whenever geopolitical differences or competition among the P5 reflect themselves in a blockade of the Security Council, that actually costs lives in third countries, in third world countries. We have seen that in Syria, we have seen that in Libya. Fortunately, I must say, we have not seen it in the country in which I serve now, and so therefore and probably that goes a little bit against the discourse here in our Tokyo conference. I'm very much hoping that on central issues of peace and security, unity can be preserved, either preserved or can be put together again among the P5. Thank you.
ちょっといろいろ議論が出て、あと2、3分しかないんですが、最後に何個か話してほしい、1分ずつ話してほしい人がいるんですが、カルロさんに対する質問にも答えてほしいんですが、初めに発言したリンゼーさんとオンケンオさん、あとゴマールさん、1分ずつ最後にまとめてくれますか、今日の話を。じゃあリンゼーさんからお願いします。
Well, simply let me thank you for the opportunity to participate again in the conference. I mean, I think what has been put on the table is that there are a lot of possibilities, but that there's sort of no hitting a button and going back to some past time when cooperation among like-minded countries came about easily or naturally. I'm not sure that time ever existed, but I think Volker is quite right that we need to keep in mind not only that you had the 4 years of Trump, which was unusual, but we're in a different geopolitical context than we were even 5 or 6 years ago. And so I think the major challenge is going to be the United States, which seeks to lead. Can it put forward an agenda that overlaps in terms of both interests, goals, and tactics with the desires of its friends, partners, and allies? And the reality is there are significant differences in all three of those dimensions. And it will be a test of American diplomacy as to whether the Biden notion of America is back is going to succeed. And again, it won't be determined simply by choices in Washington, but by choices in Berlin and in Paris, in London, Rome, and elsewhere. Tokyo, I might also add.
はい、ありがとうございます。じゃあ、オンケンオさん、今日明日出られないと言ってましたんで、1分でお願いします。
Thank you, sir. I hope you can hear me now. Yeah. I am sorry tomorrow I won't be joining you because I have to go to do a artificial intelligence conference at the same time as your conference. Yeah. I want to make a quick point, which is that I don't think ASEAN countries are giving up on democracy, and the young people of ASEAN, they have something to look forward to because they feel that their countries are progressing quite positively towards the new digital and internet era, and they want their government to do more. And I think various ASEAN countries, ASEAN governments are keen to do more. And unfortunately for us right now, we seem to be caught in between all the big strategic issues that are undergoing different changes and different management. The last point I want to make is that the basis of traditional diplomacy in the transatlantic arena and maybe between US and Northeast Asia, as Volker Perthes said, the tradition position is no more, and I think we have to adjust to the new try to find a way to manage this complicated set of relationships. Thank you.
はい、本当に最後に503になりました。1分でお願いします。
Thank you, Kudo-san. Now, very briefly, maybe just one thing. It is, you know, this notion of public space, maybe, which is changing if we try to think about the future of democracy. And that's positive in a sense. I think that, you know, in Europe, we are approaching a much more European public space, making all the time comparison when you are seated in Paris with what happened in Roma, what happened in London, what happened in Berlin, and so on. So in a sense, there is a convergence of the discussions in supranational public space. The same can be said in a sense with a sort of transatlantic public space. There are a lot of discussions. So the question, in fact, for the future of democracy is certainly the type of global conversation we can be able to frame. And in that sense, your initiative, the Tokyo Conference, is a very helpful initiative.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。本当に503さんの言ってることでまとめてくれて本当に感謝します。今日2時間渡って議論したんですが、やっぱりこういうなんていうんですかね、これ結構本音ペースの議論っていうのが される空間っていうのは私も非常に楽しんでます。非常に学ぶことも多かったと思います。今、小丸さん言ったような、私たちも同じようなことを考えています。つまり公共空間が国境を越えて広がっていると。その中で新しい対話のメカニズムを私たちも作ろうと思ってますし、それは国内でもそういう視点を持った対話を作ろうと思っています。そういう意味で今回の議論はいろんなことを気づかせてくれました。明日もまだ動きますので、ぜひ時間のある方は参加していただきたいと思います。今日はアジアはもうこれ夜中なんですね、もう。で、アメリカはまだ朝かな、ヨーロッパはお昼。皆さんそれぞれの時間で全力でこの対話に挑んでいただいて本当にありがとうございました。今後ともこの対話をこういう形で本音ベースでやっていきたいのでご協力いただければと思います。私からは感謝の言葉で終わらせてもらいます。
Warm gratitude, all of you, and thank you very much for this informative, in-depth discussion. And even in some technical difficulties, I will appreciate your contribution. Thank you very much. And some of you, I will see you tomorrow, and all of you, see you next time in Tokyo, hopefully. So, thank you very much. 皆様ありがとうございました。それではこれにて東京会議第1日目の議論を終了いたします。日本の視聴者の皆様につきまして遅くまでお付き合いくださいまして誠にありがとうございました。そして明日も日本時間18時から自由経済秩序、民主主義、そしてグローバルヘルスガバナンスについて議論をいたします。ぜひご参加くださいますようお願いいたします。皆様どうもありがとうございました。それではまたよろしくお願いいたします。失礼いたします。